As drivers and as driving instructors, we should be evaluating our own driving and encouraging our learners to self assess their driving too. But other than getting them to score themselves 0 to 10, do we actually give them the tools they need to help them self evaluate?
Would I fail for that? That's a question I get asked a lot during driving lessons. And in this video, we'll explain the way that examiners would determine whether you were going to pass or fail. First of all, what do I do when I'm asked that question? How do I deal with it? Well, one perfectly valid answer is don't answer it. Now, that might be appropriate if we're looking at a mock test scenario where we're simulating what would happen during a real driving test, and you wouldn't get any feedback on your driving until the very end of the test. So, if I am doing a mock test and the learner asks me, would I fail for that, or would that be a serious fault? I will ignore the question. If it's not a mock test and we are on a lesson, then I think it's important to realise that we are always trying to drive at the best of our ability. And it might be appropriate to say, well, it might make you fail. That might have been a serious fault because blah, blah, blah. But on this occasion, it might have been a driving fault, what we commonly call a minor fault, because XYZ. But it's also very important to explain that driving faults can very easily become serious faults because it's very situation dependent. What's happening at the time inside and outside the car can make a difference between something being a driving fault, a serious fault, or a dangerous fault, or no fault at all. Maybe the best way, though, is to give the learner the skills to analyse their own driving, which is one of the roles of the National Standard for Driving Cars and Light Vans. Now, there's no need for the learner to be as detailed and as highly trained as an examiner or even a driving instructor. But it is useful for us as driving instructors to fully understand the marking process so that we can maybe use the same tools that examiners would use when we're formulating our own assessment and helping the learner to formulate their own assessment. So we're going to look at a defined outcome, the definition of various faults, how the level of risk can change whether something is a driving fault or a serious fault, and then a few tools that examiners use themselves, and as part of their training they will learn about these tools, and they're called before and after, breach of legal requirement, the 16th driving fault, and adding and taking away. Now, just to note, I'm a driving instructor, I'm not a driving examiner. I've never been trained as a driving examiner. I'm getting my information from my experience as a driving instructor, but also from the official guidance called Guidance for Driving Examiners Carrying Out Driving Tests, which is available on gov.uk. The link is on the screen, or simply search in Google for DT1. So what do we mean by a defined outcome? Well, a defined outcome is what is expected of a driver in any situation. The official definition of the outcome is whatever it says in the National Standard for Driving Cars and Light Vans. It can also make use of instructors' knowledge and skill because we are also considered subject matter experts. Driving faults are then compared against what would be the defined outcome, and if the driver deviates from the defined outcome, then a fault has occurred. We can also compare defined outcomes against the Highway Code and the official DVSI guide to driving the essential skills. So here's an example of a defined outcome. Let's take moving off safely. The expected performance, as described in the national standard and in Driving the Essential Skills, could be signal your intention to move off to other road users where needed. Now, if the driver, the candidate, the learner, whatever you want to call them, moves off without a signal when another vehicle is planning to turn right across their path, well, that could be a deviation from the defined outcome and could therefore be a driving fault. Another example, the expected performance in the national standard says how traffic and weather conditions may affect other road users, such as reducing visibility, and how to allow for this. Now, let's say the candidate drives with a 2-second following distance in wet weather. That's a deviation from the defined outcome because the defined outcome would be a 4-second following distance, and it's therefore some kind of fault. The weight or the severity of the fault, i.e. is it a driving fault, a serious fault or a dangerous fault, we haven't yet decided. We've just decided there has been a deviation from the defined outcome and a fault has therefore occurred. So something that's not worthy of recording according to the guidelines is any insignificant deviation from the defined outcome that does not compromise safety or could be considered a matter of finesse. So, for example, attempting to move off from the side of the road in third gear, we've all done it, realising and selecting first gear without stalling and affecting other road users. Or maybe not switching off the windscreen wipers when it stopped raining. Safety is not compromised. So it's not recorded, it's not considered worthy of calling a fault. Now, instructors, note, not being worthy of recording as a fault does not mean it's not worthy of discussing as part of your lesson. A driving fault, then, is one that falls short of or deviates from the defined outcome of the standard of driving of a safe and competent driver. On its own, a driving fault would not normally result in failure to pass the test. But a candidate who habitually commits a driving fault in one aspect of their driving throughout the test cannot be regarded as competent to pass the test. The repeated fault could then be assessed as potentially dangerous. We'll look at some examples shortly. A serious fault is one that is potentially dangerous or entails a breach of the law. Again, more to come on that later. And a dangerous fault is one that involves actual danger to the examiner, the candidate, the general public, or somebody else's property. Now we can also define the different faults by the level of risk that they create. It's almost a second way that the examiner could think about whether it's not worthy, driving fault, serious fault, or dangerous fault. And some examples for this: not worthy of recording, any insignificant deviation from the defined outcome, but the important thing is safety is not compromised. Some examples: dry steering, not putting the handbrake on when you've stopped for a short while, or sequential gear changes instead of block gear changes. Low risk may contribute to it being a driving fault. A significant deviation from the defined outcome, but which does not compromise safety. Some examples might be occasional lack of mirror use before signalling, so long as the mirrors are checked later on. Misjudgment of another vehicle's speed when emerging from a junction, causing that vehicle to slow, but without compromising safety. Or maybe touching the curb with the back wheel during a reverse park when the surrounding area is clear of pedestrians. Higher risk. a deviation from the defined outcome which could compromise safety if repeated. So an example, although there might not have been actual danger at the time, the candidate failed to take adequate precautions to check if there was any danger. So maybe emerging from a junction without effective observation, changing lanes without using the external mirrors, or it could be a breach of the law, failing to stop at a red traffic light or failing to stop at a stop sign. And the highest risk, actual danger, safety and control or a legal requirement is breached that would have caused actual danger. For example, the candidate did not take effective observation before emerging at the junction and completely misjudged the speed and distance of another vehicle, and the examiner had to use the dual brake to avoid a collision. Obviously, if a collision does occur, as in the first slide that you saw on here, I think you guessed it, that would be a fail as well, wouldn't it? So let's have a look at some of the tools then that the examiners are trained to use to help them decide if something is not worthy of a fault, a driving fault, a serious fault, or a dangerous fault. Now, one of the tools that they can use is called the 16th fault. This is a hypothetical question that they would ask themselves whenever the candidate has done something that deviates from the defined outcome. The examiner would ask themselves, if they had already committed 15 driving faults, would this 16th fault be worthy of making them fail? So it's a hypothetical threshold used to help determine if another driving fault should be recorded. And it helps distinguish between it being a driving fault or not worthy of recording. Here's an example. We're driving down a steep hill. The candidate recognises that the car is about to exceed the speed limit because of the hill, and the candidate changes to a more appropriate gear. So they change from 5th gear down to 4th gear. Now, while the clutch is down, the car exceeds the speed limit by a few miles an hour before returning to 50 miles an hour when they bring the clutch back up in 4th gear. Now compare that to allowing the car to exceed the speed limit for a prolonged period because they simply hadn't noticed that they were doing 53 or 54 miles an hour. So the hypothetical question, if that was the 16th fault, if they'd already got 15 driving faults, could you justify recording a fault that would result in it being a fail? So in the case of when the clutch is depressed, the car goes a couple of miles an hour over the speed limit, maybe that isn't justified in giving another fault. So that would be a hypothetical pass. If the case was the car was allowed to exceed the speed limit for a prolonged period because the learner hadn't realised, maybe that would be worthy of a driving fault and it could be justified in giving it a fail. Another tool then that the examiners use is called before and after. Its official name is called the first rule of assessment, but it's commonly called before and after. And it helps distinguish between a driving fault and a serious fault or a dangerous fault. And the question the examiner will ask themselves in their mind is, if the driving was perfect up to this point, and if it was perfect after this point, would this fault, and only this fault, cause the candidate to fail their test? Now, this is a brilliant tool that I use as a driving instructor because it helps me isolate my knowledge of how the learner normally drives from how they are driving at the moment. It's very easy when we've known a learner for a long time to take the attitude, oh, they don't normally do that, I'll let them off, they've just had a brain fart. Or well, they've never done that junction before, so I couldn't really expect them to know what lane to use. Or maybe they've never experienced that unusual situation before. Maybe it's the first time that they have encountered an ambulance coming from behind them. So here's an example of a before and after decision. On a lesson, let's imagine the learner has driven perfectly for the previous 45 minutes and then forgets to signal left when leaving a roundabout. Would that fault alone justify a fail, a serious fault? Probably not. No danger has occurred because of the lack of left signal. It's inconvenienced other road users but not caused danger. Could it justifiably be recorded as a driving fault then, which would not be a fail? In my opinion, yes it could. What about drifting to the right when checking the left mirror? Even if the learner had driven perfectly for the previous 45 minutes or so, if they drift out of their lane, could that fault alone justify them failing? In my opinion, yes it could. Could it justifiably be recorded as a driving fault, which would then not be a fail? In my opinion, no it couldn't. Now, if there is a breach of legal requirement, this is quite easy. This is quite black and white here. A breach of legal requirement during the driving test is where the candidate violates the law or regulation governing the road use. The purpose of the driving test is to assess if the candidate can drive within the law. So, some examples on this: not responding to a red traffic light, driving well above the speed limit, failing to stop at a stop sign, maybe driving over the central marking of a mini roundabout. That would be an automatic serious fault. Now, the final tool that examiners will use when they're working out if something is a driving fault, not worthy, serious or dangerous, is called adding and taking away. And again, it's a question that the examiner will ask themselves when they've spotted something that deviates from the defined outcome. Could you add anything to that fault to make it worse? Or could you take anything away from it to make it better? This lets the examiner almost visualise in their mind how bad or how good something is. So here's an example. When the candidate is pulling up on the left, they brush the curb with the front wheel. And the examiner will ask themselves, could this actually be worse? And the answer is yes. The candidate could have bumped into the curb faster, or they could have actually mounted the curb and ended up driving on the pavement. Could it be better? Could something be taken away from this fault so that it is better than it was? And the answer might be yes, if the candidate had positioned the vehicle slightly further from the curb, or maybe if the candidate had approached the pulling up on the left a little slower at lower speed, then it could have been a perfect manoeuvre. And this might then help the examiner decide, is it worthy of a serious fault? Is it a driving fault, or is it a dangerous fault, or is it not worthy at all? So by using this tool, examiners are able to assess each fault in a broader context. If a fault could realistically have been worse, it might indicate that it's only a driving fault rather than a serious fault. If a fault could not have been significantly worse, in that it was already pretty bad, it might indicate that it's a serious fault or a dangerous fault. Conversely, if to improve the situation would only require a small adjustment, it might not warrant recording as fault at all, and it might be not worthy. So although it's tempting to ask your instructor, would I fail for that? It is encouraged that drivers evaluate their own driving, and that is part of the national standard for driving cars. So now with these tools that you've been given, Perhaps you can decide for yourself.